Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Avenging Varus Part 6, The Fate of Arminius and Germanicus, the last episode in this series. We have seen the Roman campaigns against Germania, first under Tiberius, then under the skillful leadership of Germanicus. Last time we saw those campaigns come to an end, cut off by Tiberius. Now we get to see what has happened to our two main characters. What happens to Arminius and what happens to Germanicus. I'm very excited to see. Now, if you guys enjoy this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The dark stain of Teutoburg had left quite the mark on the military record of Rome.
Yeah.
Remembered today as a great disaster, at the time its sting was even more acutely felt. However, as we have seen in this series, there was almost no lengths to which the Empire would not go to seek vengeance. But it wasn't just a matter of getting even. In the eyes of Rome, the scales of justice could only be balanced with a pile of Germanic corpses so large that it would eclipse that of the sons of Mars.
Yeah, it's a pretty Roman perspective. They're exactly right. This wasn't just about getting even. Okay, well, you defeated us, now we have to defeat you. Like they said, it was about piling Germanic corpses as high as they could, killing as many as they could, and truly demolishing these Germans in combat. And it is truly remarkable the impact the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had. I mean, we've been talking about it for this entire series, every single episode, and though this was a pretty impressive recovery for the Romans, and they regained a lot of their lost courage, their egos were healed, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest would continue to make an impression really throughout the rest of Roman history. Well, until things started getting really bad and people had far bigger concerns. But though this was an impressive strike back from the Romans, and it did, I think, cover up a lot of those negative emotions, some of them would remain maybe a little more under the surface.
Thus, for 7 years, the blood feud across the Rhine was waged with unrelenting fury. Battles were won, villages were burned, and eagles were recovered.
Yes.
Yet barbarian steel and northern storms proved a formidable foe, exacting a heavy toll of attrition on the Romans.
Yeah, I mean, if you had to look at these campaigns as a whole, I would say pretty decisive, strong success for the Romans, but that success definitely hurt. Germanicus seemed really unlucky with the storms. He dealt with some storms that really did a lot of damage to his fleet, but the Germans put up a pretty tough fight. These Germanic tribes, they did a lot of losing, but they put up a good fight, and they definitely inflicted some damage on the Romans. So, while the Romans did sort of sweep in and win victory after victory, it maybe wasn't that overwhelming, or at least the Romans took some damage while they were achieving these overwhelming victories. Though, if these campaigns had continued, the Romans, I imagine, would have been even more dominant in the future, because the Germans were definitely getting worn down over time. They didn't have the sort of manpower and resources that Rome could draw on. Though, once again, it's not like Rome wasn't being worn down at all. They were, to a certain extent.
Thus, when the back of the Germanic resistance was broken following the Battle of the Angevarian Wall, the emperor deigned that the war machine had been sated. A line was now drawn in the sand by the imperial throne, separating both Arminius and Germanicus, who otherwise would have eagerly dueled until the end of time. Today, let us conclude our series by examining...
I think Germanicus would have come out on the top eventually. Arminius he's a competent guy for sure, and he knows how to wriggle out of a bad situation, but at this point Germanicus had gotten the upper hand several times. So I think if that fight had been allowed to continue, Germanicus would have come out victorious, though I'm sure Arminius would have put up a formidable fight, and maybe even if the fight had continued, he could have saved his own life. I mean, we've seen before, he survived many battles when a lot of the people around him have died, so he's definitely been a survivor throughout this series for sure.
Each of their eventual fates.
All right, let's see what both of them ended up doing and how they ended.
Let us begin with the final chapter of Arminius.
All right.
His career is quite well documented for a Romano-German chieftain, which is a great testament to the scale of his accomplishments.
Well, yeah, you can understand why they'd be keeping tabs on Arminius, or not even keeping tabs, but why people would be paying attention to this man. What an important role he has played for someone of his position, definitely an outsized role in Roman history. Now, I know a lot more about Germanicus than I do about Arminius, so I am curious to see what exactly Arminius ends up doing.
Unfortunately, however, this primarily revolves around his dealings with Rome. Once war abated, ancient authors seemingly lost interest with his life, and we have few records of what happened after the withdrawal of the legions.
Damn, okay.
Nonetheless, we shall endeavor to piece together a story. It seems that following the defeat at the Angravarian Wall, a wounded Arminius and his closest companions pulled back to the northeast. They were probably unsure of just how dedicated the pursuit would be, and therefore focused on putting as much distance between themselves and the legions as possible. This likely meant finding refuge in the eastern lands of the Carusi along the river Alba. Here, the ever-diplomatic-minded Arminius...
Yeah, and I will say one of the advantages the Germans had, and honestly one of the advantages that they didn't necessarily have to draw on too much, but if the conflict had continued, they would have drawn on more, was the amount of vast, untamed, and hostile to the Romans territory that they had. I mean, look how far Arminius has been able to pull back. Look at the distance between him and, for example, the Rhine River. Now, the campaigns that we saw were more direct engagements. You can imagine, though, if they had continued and if it had really become a long, long war of attrition, the Germans probably would have made better use of all of that space they had. You want to come get us, Romans? All right, you got to march through all of this hostile, unfamiliar territory. And so you can see at this point, just to once again point out how far east Arminius has ended up. Though, a lot of that is because of the strong Roman conquests and victories in sort of, I guess you'd call it, Western Germania.
Would have opened communications to gauge the situation in Germania and find new potential allies. These would have to come from the east, as few tribes of the west would entertain such talks, with legions still lurking in their backyards.
Right.
However, when the Roman fleet was savaged by a storm on its return journey, we can speculate that Arminius once again attempted to capitalize on this opportunity by riling up anti-Roman sentiment across the lands. Yet what few advances he might have gained were soon wiped out when the Romans rebounded, returning in full force to squash all resistance by the end of the 16 AD campaign season.
Yeah, that was definitely a good move from Germanius. That was a smart move because Arminius, he's a determined guy. He will always try and take advantage of any Roman misfortune. And so, another storm, Arminius is ready to say, all right, pick up your arms, let's go back to war, everybody, let's rally. So, very intelligent decision from Germanicus to say, you know what, we're not down, we're going right back in. A lot of other generals would have taken much more time to rest and recuperate. Germanicus was like, we need to show these tribes that we mean business, and regardless of what happens to us, whether it be a major defeat or a fleet being destroyed in one of countless storms, we are ready to rush right back in and show them who's boss, and that's exactly what he did.
Season. The following year, however, would see the end of the offensives and a recall of Germanicus.
Right.
Thus, 17 AD saw diplomats rather than armies cross the Rhine. Now, the Roman policy was to treat these clans as client kingdoms, maintaining the frontier with a mix of carrots and sticks meant to play the tribes off one another.
Yeah, some pretty typical Roman policy. So we have sort of several levels of Roman policy. What I mean by that is we have, say, use Gaul as an example. That's the example I've been using this entire series. Julius Caesar goes in, marches around, and after a certain amount of time, Rome has fully conquered these Gallic tribes. It brings them into the empire. Now, of course, a lot of these tribes still remain. They have their own separate identities, but they are part of the Roman Empire. Then you have what Germania usually is to the Romans, this sort of untamed foreign land. And now you have sort of an in-between point, which is what we're seeing now, where, they're not fully under the control of the Roman Empire. These German tribes are not part of the empire. They haven't been brought into Rome, but they are being treated as client kingdoms, some of them allies, some enemies. But what that means is that though Rome may not be there, with the influence Rome has from the recent conquests, not to mention all the legions stationed at the west of the Rhine River, Rome is able to exert a sizable influence over the geopolitical situation. Like I said, through those conquests, through coercion, and basically the threat of those legions, and through trade and diplomacy, as we're seeing here.
In this reframed geopolitical world, the various Germanic chiefs had much to consider. One of the major positions they wrestled with was just how closely they should embrace Rome.
Yeah.
Arminius naturally found himself establishing a base of power as the faction which championed Germanic freedoms, forever swearing to oppose the hated Romans.
And I think here you can sort of understand both sides. You have Arminius. He'll be saying, we've fought so hard against these Romans. We fought to maintain our freedom and autonomy. We've faced these legions. We've faced these terrible battles. Do you want to give away your autonomy now through diplomacy? I mean, come on, you're falling right into the Roman trap. They can't get us through war, we've resisted them, well, now they come with their diplomats. But you can also understand the other side of the argument. They'll say, look, we resisted Rome through warfare, now that's over. Rome comes to us through diplomacy, they want to have a relationship, that can be beneficial for us too. We can still maintain our independence while having a relationship with the Roman Empire, which is, this massively powerful empire. It is in our interest to have some sort of relationship. So you can really understand the different perspectives here.
While this was still an appealing message in theory, the reality of nearly a decade of war meant that many were jaded by this approach.
Yeah.
Therefore, power in the region began to consolidate around other chiefs with a more friendly disposition towards Rome. One of the greatest rivals to Arminius was Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni. His tribe had a formidable reputation as great warriors who clashed with Roman armies in the past. This respect was evident in 9 AD, when Arminius had actually sent the head of Varus to Maroboduus, hoping to gain his alliance.
Yeah, do we remember that? Yeah, the Marcomanni, a very powerful tribe in the region, with a fair amount of geopolitical influence, I would say. Though, as you can see, just sort of geographically, they're a bit southeast of sort of the main center of action we've been talking about throughout this series.
However, in the war that followed, the Marcomanni king had remained neutral, which now allowed him to play the peacemaker. He could even boast of never having been defeated by the legions, in contrast to the battered Arminius, who had accumulated a fair share of losses in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a smart and opportunistic approach. I'm sure some of the more fervent amongst Arminius's camp might call him a coward or not committed to the cause or whatever, but from the perspective of the Marcomanni, they keep out of it, they stay neutral, and now when everything's over, they can jump back in and, like they said, play the role of peacemaker. Say, hey, you know what? Why don't we negotiate between the two sides, and we'll just get a little something out of that. At the very least, you'll get even more geopolitical control of the situation.
This rivalry apparently escalated to such a degree that the two chieftains came to blows. Normally, such intertribal spats would have involved a series of raids and skirmishes to sort out who was top dog. However, owing to the severity of their animosity, and perhaps the degree to which the recent years had militarized the Germanic peoples, this war quickly escalated into a major conflict.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, think about how these Roman campaigns have affected sort of the climate, the environment here, the military environment, I mean. Usually, and as we've seen throughout this series, the German tribes, they love their raiding. They do a lot of raiding back and forth. They are used to this sort of more small-scale style of combat. But through these Roman campaigns, there's been a lot of military activity. These tribes have become very, very militarized, and they've now gotten used to these massive, large-scale engagements, very different style than the typical small-scale raids. And so you can imagine that will affect the way they participate in warfare and politics in the future.
The two sides apparently meeting in a climactic pitched battle. Unfortunately, details are frustratingly scarce, with our main source Tacitus depicting the battle in more symbolic terms as a clash of ideals.
Right.
Arminius was the freedom fighter, striving for a united German people and trying to excise the cancer of Roman sycophants. Maroboduus, on the other hand, touted his great strength and his ability to coexist with Rome. While Arminius fought for ancient glories and...
Once again, at least I can see how both of those sides could be attractive in one way or another, and not to be too much of a broken record, but we have seen all this before. You can think back on a lot of conflicts in a lot of different regions. Hispania, I always draw back to Gaul. That's a good example. Think back on our friend Vercingetorix. He's the very image of the, quote-unquote barbarian, from a Roman perspective, barbarian freedom fighter that Arminius is sort of embodying to a certain extent here, though, Arminius is very Romanized. But yeah, sort of a seemingly familiar conflict, but one which you can definitely understand.
Freedom, Maroboduus fought to increase the size and influence of his own kingdom. As for the fighting itself, Tacitus mentions only that it was hard fought. We have no other sources or archaeological findings to go on, and so must imagine a battle fought in the traditional Germanic fashion. Perhaps, though, Arminius may have borrowed a trick or two from his time spent fighting with and against the Romans. Whatever the source of advantage, it ultimately made him the victor of the field.
Yeah, we don't really know what happened, but first off, Arminius has always been a tricky guy. Second off, he had that Roman military education. Third off, with all of his experience versus the Macromani, who their whole thing was that they stayed out of it, you can imagine how Arminius might have a strategic and tactical advantage in this battle. He has a couple of tricks and strategies up his sleeve that he can pull out when necessary.
In the aftermath, Maroboduus was forced to retreat into the hilly forests of Bohemia. Here, he would prove just as elusive as Arminius had been to the Romans in the years prior, and managed to outlast his pursuer. The following year, though, Maroboduus would be challenged by a younger nobleman and forced into exile. He would then flee to Rome, and eventually be held in captive in Ravenna.
Well, would you look at that?
Arminius, meanwhile, returned to his own tribe. Here, he continued to plot a way to unite the disparate tribes. Yet after 4 long years of frustrating negotiations, he was getting nowhere. The prediction of Emperor Tiberius proved prescient. Left to their own devices, the tribes would fall prey to their own petty squabbles.
Yeah, and look, here's the thing. One of the reasons that these tribes fought against Rome so hard was that they wanted to defend their freedom and autonomy. And of course, having Arminius unify them is very different than being conquered and forcefully unified by the Roman Empire, but you could still imagine how these tribes would be very resistant to any kind of central authority, and that's basically what Arminius is trying to do, no matter how lightly he's attempting some degree of centralization and unification, and they don't want that. They definitely don't want it from the Romans, but they don't really want it from Arminius either, even though they would be stronger under a unified leadership. They would be, much more able to resist outside incursion. That's not what they want. They want their freedom. They want their autonomy, even from each other.
This was of course facilitated by the favors and gold which passed over the Rhine to ensure that no single chieftain grew too powerful. Eventually, this yielded an opportunity for Rome to finally rid themselves of Arminius without having to expend a single drop of blood.
And like I said, this is how Rome influences affairs even outside the empire. They haven't conquered this region, but they first off have the threat of violence always present, though more importantly in this case, there's diplomacy and money. The two most important factors, especially the gold. They can send in their diplomats, negotiate, do favors with people, supply them, and then send in gold, trade routes, all that sort of stuff, so that they can maintain a sort of balance of power without having to send in Roman legions.
A chieftain of the Conti had sent a letter to Tiberius, apparently offering to kill the most wanted man in the empire if poison were sent. The letter was read aloud in the Senate, and according to Tacitus, quote, the reply was that it was not by secret treachery, but openly and by arms that the people of Rome avenged themselves of their enemies. A noble answer, by which Tiberius sought to liken himself to the generals of old who had forbidden and even denounced the poisoning of King Pyrrhus.
Yeah. And so, basically Tiberius refuses. As Invicta puts it, making the point that, well, this isn't the way we do things. Now, that's pretty ironic because Rome does lots of treachery and poisoning, so, you can interpret this for yourself, whether he's being genuine. Maybe this is just a political play to make himself look good, or maybe there was some other reason why it was inconvenient to attempt to assassinate Arminius, and this is just an excuse. I don't know. Could be one of several reasons, but basically Tiberius puts the kibosh on this, at least for now.
At least that's how the story gets reported.
Right.
In reality, it's hard to know just how much truth there was to this deliberate grandstanding.
Exactly.
Who knows just what schemes were being wrought by the spy masters of Rome?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it was they who played a hand.
Whenever you hear a noble Roman proclamation written down by a Roman historian, doubt that. Take that with a massive, massive grain of salt and try and look a little deeper, even if we don't really know what happened. We can only speculate. But, we know that it may not have been that and could have been a variety of different things.
In the eventual conspiracy which led members of the Carusi tribe to murder Arminius in 21 AD.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we shall never know.
Nope.
Yet either way, the demise of the war leader caused many across the lands to weep at his loss. It seems that even the Romans grudgingly recognized the magnitude of the man who had passed. Tacitus leaves the following eulogy, quote, assuredly he was the deliverer of Germany, one too who had defied Rome not in her early rise as other kings and generals, but in the height of her empire's glory, had fought indecisive battles, yet in war remained unconquered. He completed 37 years of life, 12 years of power, and even now he remains a theme of songs among barbarous nations.
Yeah, a lot of people, a lot of fans of Roman history will look at this history from the Roman perspective, and I understand that. I mean, that's where we get most of, if not all of our sources from for a lot of these events. A lot of people connect with Roman history, and I do too, to a certain extent. But, I always feel sympathy for characters like Vercingetorix or an Arminius, these sort of, freedom fighters who fight back against sort of the conquests of imperial Rome. Now, that's a very naive way of looking at it. There's always more under the surface, but like I said, at least for me, I do feel a lot of sympathy for characters throughout history like this. And so, I find myself taking at least a bit of a liking to someone like Arminius and his attempt to fight back against Rome.
Germanicus, meanwhile, was also the subject of much praise among his people.
On to Germanicus.
In true Roman fashion, this would take the form of the ultimate honor.
Triumph!
Such celebrations had been quite common during the Republic, representing the pinnacle of success for any general. However, in the era of Augustus, full triumphs had become a rarity, as the emperor was wary of allowing any potential rivals to shine too brightly.
Yes, this is a very good thing to illustrate. As they said, during the Republic, triumphs were far more common. You have a successful general who's won some battles or conquered some territory. They come back, they get a triumph. In fact, some might say triumphs were a little too common. You had guys getting triumphs for things that maybe they didn't deserve one for. But then, during the Empire, the Augustan era, as they call it, triumphs would become far less common because, like they said, the emperor was wary of allowing anyone but themselves to garner that level of praise and popularity. And the further we go into the empire, the less common triumphs come for anybody except the emperor himself. Yeah, if the emperor goes on campaign and wins some impressive battles, he'll come back and hold himself a majestic triumph. But other generals, no, too risky. And so, and remember, we're still fairly early into the Roman Empire. I mean, I know Augustus himself ruled for decades, but Tiberius is only our second emperor. So we are, it all depends on perspective. We are fairly detached from the Republic, but maybe not too detached. A lot of those traditions are still remembered, or at least remembered more than they will be in decades to follow, or the hundreds of years to follow. Anyway, it is a big deal for Germanicus to get this triumph, and it was as triumphs go, it was a massive, massive celebration. The public was ecstatic, everyone was celebrating, having fun, praising Germanicus, all that sort of stuff.
Yet they still had their place in the realm of imperial propaganda. The grant by Tiberius of a full triumph for Germanicus, for example, was a clear signal to all that the returning general was to be recognized as the successor to the throne.
And there's that as well, and we've talked about this throughout the series, but Germanicus was basically shaping up to be Tiberius's successor and heir. He was being groomed to be the next emperor. And with all of this success, Germanicus comes back and gets a triumph. The question, well, if he wasn't in that position, if he wasn't the heir, would he have gotten a triumph? I don't know. He was a beloved and successful general, but the fact that he has this position helps a lot because, instead of Tiberius looking at it as a threat to his position, he can look at it as, well, he's going to take over from me, I should be building him up. He's, the person who will take over once I'm gone. Though, that doesn't mean that Tiberius won't be maybe a little jealous and suspicious, as we saw last time, and you can imagine how that might grow over time, not to give away too much.
In addition, the hosting of a triumph was an excellent way to boost public support of the regime. Everyone loved a good parade, especially those that made them feel like masters of the world, and which were followed by days of feasting.
It's kind of a double-edged sword if you think about it from Tiberius's perspective. So, and I might be jumping the gun a little bit, but, Tiberius, as we saw from that letter last time, is clearly a little worried about Germanicus getting too popular and overshadowing him. That's a concern of his. And so this triumph could contribute to that. But also, the more popular Germanicus is, sort of the more praise he brings to the administration. And, the more praise he brings to Tiberius, who heads this whole family, this whole imperial dynasty at the moment. And so, you're sort of teetering on the edge. It's like, okay, well, we want to praise Germanicus because we want him to bring this public morale boost and bring praise to the imperial family, but we don't want him individually to get too powerful because maybe that could threaten my position. So you can sort of see, what's at play here.
This one, in particular, was an event that none would miss, as it was a chance for all to partake in the Avenging of Varus. Thus, on May 26, 17 AD, Germanicus kicked off his triumph to raucous applause. In true superstar fashion, he rode in on a two-wheeled chariot pulled by 4 horses, splendidly adorned in purple and gold, his face painted red. A laurel crown was held above his head by a slave, who would gently murmur in his ear as the procession continued, reminding him that he was still mortal.
This was a common part of triumphs, by the way. The individual holding the crown above your head would whisper in your ear to remind you, you are still a man. This was not something they just did for this one. This is what they did for triumphs. But, also, if you're unfamiliar with the triumph, you can sort of begin to see why it might make the emperor a little nervous. We talked about how uncommon triumphs became, unless they were being held for the emperor himself. Well, because, you have this laurel wreath, or maybe a crown of sorts, don't say that word, held above your head. You're adorned in these purple robes, of course, purple, the color of royalty. A lot of these things that would become sort of symbols of the imperial dynasty. In fact, Caesar picked up a lot of these things from the triumph, the triumphal purple clothing and the wreath and all that sort of stuff. All these things that would become associated with the imperial dynasty were granted to this one individual for this big celebration. And so, if that person isn't the emperor or isn't even part of the imperial family, then it's like, oh, okay, well, what does this say? Do they deserve to be adorned with these imperial colors? Are we suggesting too much? Does that threaten the emperor's position and the emperor's image?
Behind the general was his wife and 5 children in a chariot of their own. They too received great cheers as word spread of how she had been the perfect mother, not just of the family, but of the legions in Germania. Behind these marched the legions who had fought through the forests and swamps of Germania. 50,000 veterans in their polished armor, playing rousing marching songs and loudly belting ribald songs at their general's expense. Behind them would be the mountains of loot that had been stolen from the German people, prisoners of war, and floats that gave visual representations to the battles that had been won.
Prisoners of war, but not Germanicus. Vercingetorix, who I've referenced a few times, he was marched through the streets of Rome and executed, but not Arminius. Arminius, he managed to avoid this humiliation. He did not see himself paraded through the streets and then publicly executed. Good for him.
This train included captives from every German tribe. Conspicuous among them was Thusnelda, the wife of Arminius, and their young son, who had served as a stand-in for the yet uncaptured Germanic chieftain. This procession wound its way through the streets of Rome, ultimately ending at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, where Germanicus would ceremonially sacrifice a white cow to the god, symbolically beginning a festival that would last for days.
Nice.
When these
Fun
celebrations had finally abated, it was time for the hero of Rome's next assignment. Having mastered the northern border, he would now be sent east. In recent years, this area had been of increasing importance to the empire, owing to its great wealth and resource production.
Yes. So, there's a couple of reasons why Germanicus was sent east. One, the increasing importance of the region. He was needed there to be an administrator and a general, Also, in recent years, someone being sent to the east was a good sign that they were in the line for more power, particularly that they were the chosen imperial heir. I mean, Tiberius had been sent east. This was a very important region of the empire, basically, and you being sent eastwards to govern, that was a good sign that, okay, I see. So we already know that Germanicus is next in line, but he's really next in line. He's being given all of this authority and power.
However, since the Civil War, it had fallen into disarray. It would now be up to Germanicus to bring order to the provinces and kingdoms of the region. Once again, this was a clear sign meant to reinforce his status as the right hand of the emperor and heir apparent.
Exactly.
This was formally communicated by granting Germanicus Imperius Maius, literally the greatest power, to do as he saw fit. On the way to his new post, Germanicus would make the most of the transit voyage. He first stopped in Greece, visiting the famed cities of philosophers and mythical heroes. One of these stops was Nicopolis, a name which might not necessarily be recognizable to modern ears. To the Romans, though, Nicopolis was the best sort of tourist town. The city, whose name literally means victory town, was dedicated to Augustus's victory at Actium. It included several parks and museums dedicated to the battle, with various monuments, statues, and memorabilia.
Wow.
They even had a display of the types of ships that had been at the battle, which were maintained at anchor and ranged from the smallest monoremes to the hulking decaremes.
Oh, that's great. The Romans must have absolutely loved that. This whole town, basically this whole theme park, dedicated to one of the greatest victories of their greatest emperors. They must have been very pleased to see that.
Games and celebrations known as the Actian Games were held there annually. Germanicus even visited the actual site of the battle, a true treat for any commander such as himself.
Yeah, I'm sure.
From there, he
And you can really see now how he's truly being groomed for the position of emperor. Germanicus has returned. He's been granted a triumph, this massive celebration of his success. He's been given this greater power, sent east to reorganize the provinces, basically. That's a big responsibility, a big power to be granted. Now he's doing, maybe not a tour, but, he's visiting this site. I mean, you can sort of see the significance of all of this. If he was not next in line, he would not have been given these responsibilities and honors, at least not all of them at once.
Then went to Olympia and joined the Olympic competition for 17 AD. Amazingly, Tacitus doesn't discuss this bit, but some inscriptions survive, including this one from a statue base. It reads as follows, quote, Germanicus Caesar, son of Imperator Tiberius Caesar Augustus, victorious in the Olympic Games with his chariot drawn by 4 fully grown horses. This monument to him was erected by Marcus Antonius Paesanus, for his own patron, Germanicus, to Olympian Zeus. From Olympia, he continued on to Athens, another tourist city that...
I mean, look at him, he's on a PR tour. I said, well, maybe it's not a tour, it's a tour. You know, my man is on a tour throughout the eastern provinces, but mainly Greece, you know, where all of these important sites and cities are. He's really building his image, building his reputation, seeing all of these important sites, you know, the Olympics. I mean, my man's on a PR tour at this point.
That flaunted its architecture, art, and elite schools of oratory and philosophy. Next, he set off across the Aegean to tour the Ionian coast. His ship stopped at several famous cities, such as Halicarnassus and the legendary city of Ilium, better known as Troy.
It's also, and when I say a PR tour, I don't necessarily mean that in a derogatory way, right? I mean, he's building his own reputation, but this is also a good way for Germanicus to remind everybody in the eastern provinces that, hey, Rome is back. Now, Rome has never left, but like they said, there had been a lot of chaos, especially during the civil wars, though it has been a while since then, so I don't know how in disarray the eastern provinces were. Maybe they hadn't recovered over the last couple of decades. But if that was the case, then this is a good way for Germanicus to make that impression. Hey, Rome is back. You know, we're here to govern. We're present. You know, we haven't forgotten about the East. We're here to make some changes. It's a good way to do that. Remind everybody of that.
The expedition next ventured into the Black Sea before making a return to Greece. Here, Germanicus apparently consulted the oracle of Apollo at Claros, hoping to catch a glimpse of what the future might hold. According to legend, the prophecy he received contained dark tidings of impending doom. Likely, this would have been remedied by the appropriate sacrifices and offerings to Apollo.
Right.
Thus stated, Germanicus then continued.
Or, you know, very likely that was made up after the fact. I'm always very doubtful when I hear about these ancient prophecies or the oracles, because it is just so easy for a Roman historian, and they love doing stuff like this, to take the story of someone like Germanicus. Because remember, these historians, they were writing history, but not history in the way we look at it. They were also writing sort of literature, which was to a certain extent fictionalized. And so they were following these certain character archetypes and story archetypes. So it's so easy for a Roman historian to look at the story of someone like Germanicus, and even if they're mostly faithful, to say, well, you know, we should add in an oracle, a prophecy in there of impending doom, that would fit with this story. Or maybe they, you know, maybe they heard it, a rumor somewhere. Rumors like this would go around often, and they say, all right, well, I'll include that in my work. So I'm very doubtful whenever I hear something like that.
Continued south across the Aegean and into the Mediterranean, stopping by the island of Rhodes. It was also another great tourist site, with the ruins of the famed Colossus still visible in the harbor.
Wow.
But this stop was also a great attraction to military commanders. The city itself had seen its fair share of sieges, and its navy held a reputation as one of the most formidable forces in the ancient world. Surely, these sailors would have marveled at the stories of Rome's 1,000-ship armada that had sailed to invade Germania, though perhaps that last part about the storms was left off from the story. From there, Germanicus made his way to Armenia, involving himself in dynastic politics and organizing the province of Cappadocia.
Yep.
In these matters, he handled things with a noticeably lighter touch than had been the case.
And I will say a couple of things. You know, I said I'm not sure how in disarray the eastern provinces were, you know, since the Civil War had already been a while back, but Rome was also constantly expanding. And so it does make sense that when you are constantly expanding, you need to do a bit of consolidation, like bring some of these provinces truly under Roman administration. And once again, you know, we're seeing Rome playing that role of sort of geopolitical arbiter. I mean, we can see the difference right here between Roman administration and Rome not controlling the territory. They don't rule over Armenia, but they're involved in the politics, they're playing a role, they certainly have a high degree of authority.
With the tribes of the north, favoring diplomacy over force of arms. His intrusion was looked upon with some annoyance by the Roman political appointees of the region who had benefited from the previous status quo. Among the masses, though, Germanicus was like a touring rock star.
Yeah.
People apparently turned out in droves to embrace him wherever he went. His bodyguard supposedly even voiced concerns about the security implications of this sort of exposure.
He was a hero.
But brushing these concerns aside, Germanicus continued with his tour, wintering in the lands of Syria. After ensuring the stability in Roman Asia, and even meeting with the king of Parthia, he made his way to Egypt,
he has really got the damn tour. He's hit up Greece, Rhodes, the new province of Cappadocia, dealt with the Armenians, wintered in Syria, now on to Egypt. My goodness, that is quite the tour of the East. He hasn't, of course, hit every important spot. That would be impossible, but he has hit a lot of important spots throughout the eastern provinces.
Land of legends. Here, he took a full tour from the legendary tomb of Alexander and the wonders of Alexandria to the pyramids themselves. He gazed upon the creation of the pharaohs, the monuments and the temples of the ancient civilization, and the Nile River that was mother of them all. Amazingly, we can catch a small glimpse of what this visit was like from a fragmentary scrap of papyrus that records one of the speeches he gave to gathered crowds.
Great.
The interjections of the people are even recorded as well, and the excitement is palpable. This speaks to the propaganda power of this whole tour of the East.
Yes.
Unlike the more reserved Tiberius, Germanicus was a young, charismatic war hero who could clearly work a crowd. This was helped by the fact that many in the East had long paid homage to god kings, and a visiting member of the imperial family was the closest thing they would get to meeting a deity.
Yeah, this is great. A lot of great points being made here. So, we talked about this before, Germanicus was young, dynamic, popular, in contrast to Tiberius. Now, Tiberius had his positive qualities, but he was a little more dour. I think he was less good at handling crowd. He was a little less popular. And, at some point, I think he would become downright unpopular throughout his reign. He could be a little paranoid and suspicious, not necessarily a man of the people, and he never had been. Germanicus, the opposite. And as I said, with this whole PR tour type thing, as Germanicus tours around, he is both building his own personal reputation and building the reputation of the imperial family, the imperial dynasty. He's doing both at once. So that's, once again, the balancing act. This is positive for Tiberius. He's building his base of power. Germanicus is building it for him, but you can imagine he does get a little nervous that Germanicus is becoming a little too popular in the region. And then also on the note about these deities, I think this is absolutely true. If we look at sort of the Roman emperors being worshipped as gods and deities, I do believe a lot of that was done, especially early on in the East. Now, it'll become more widespread, more popular as time went on, but especially at this early point, a lot of that was embraced or becoming embraced sort of in the eastern provinces.
It also helped that Germanicus and his entourage acted as a miniature Roman government, granting petitions, answering prayers, and showering communities in money.
Right.
Yet everything was not all sunshine and rainbows. When Germanicus returned to Syria that summer, he found that the Roman administrator Piso had either ignored or outright revoked the orders of the imperial heir. The two had not been getting along lately, and this was the final straw. Germanicus now ordered that the man be recalled back to Rome. Piso seemed to comply, and made his way to the port of Seleucia by the sea.
Yes, so we got Piso out of there. And just to preface this, there is what we're about to see these last couple of minutes. There's a lot of speculation. As with a lot of Roman history, we don't truly know what happened. There's a lot of speculation. So what I'm going to tell you is basically purely speculative. Take it with a massive grain of salt. There is speculation that Piso was sent, or not sent, but Piso was basically meant to act as a check on Germanicus and was asked to do so by Tiberius, maybe directly, maybe indirectly. There's some speculation that that was the role he was playing as a check on the power of Germanicus. Now, we don't know if this is true. It does sort of fit with that image of the, maybe worried Tiberius, concerned that Germanicus is getting a little too big for his boots and wants to check him a little bit. So maybe it's true, but maybe that wasn't the case. But there is more to come.
Shortly thereafter, however, Germanicus fell ill. Tacitus recounts the following, quote, "The terrible intensity of the malady was increased by the belief that he had been poisoned by Piso.
Yes.
And certainly there were found hidden in the floor and in the walls disinterred remains of human bodies, incantations and spells, and the name of Germanicus inscribed on leaden tablets, half-burnt cinders smeared with blood, and other horrors by which, in popular belief, souls are devoted to the infernal deities. Piso, too, was accused of sending emissaries to note curiously every unfavorable symptom of the illness." On the 10th of October, 19 AD, a 34-year-old Germanicus would succumb to his affliction,
34.
just 2 years prior to when Arminius would ultimately perish as well. The sudden nature and odd circumstances of his demise sent the rumor mill into overdrive.
Yes. So, here we have what could be called a coincidental death. And whenever that happens in Roman history, the accusation of poison is instantly brought up. Now, I think, the Romans, especially the Roman historians, are overly obsessed with poison being the cause of every single death they encounter. But it is always worth considering. I mean, look, Roman politics was an absolute mess of treachery and betrayal. So there is every possibility that a prominent political figure dies. Well, maybe they were poisoned. And that is what a lot of people suspected here. Germanicus himself felt that Piso might have been responsible, even though he sent him away. And so, the question arises, by whose orders was Piso acting? Was he just disgruntled? Or did his orders come from high up? And once again, there's speculation, I think pretty popular speculation, though still speculation, that Piso was basically put up to this by Tiberius. Tiberius, who had become jealous and suspicious of Germanicus. He was worried that Germanicus was becoming too popular and that would threaten his position. And so Tiberius ordered Germanicus to be killed, to be poisoned. That's what a lot of people think happened. We don't know. We will never know. So, you can interpret that however you want.
Piso had cursed him with black magic.
I don't think that happened. I don't believe it was an incantation or a spell as was listed in that note. But poison, it could have been poison, perhaps, of some sort.
No, it was with poison that he did it.
Ah.
Well, I heard the Imperial Guard was to blame. Please, friend, who else but the jealous emperor could have ordered such a thing?
Right.
From our modern perspective, it seems plausible that he was merely the casualty of one of the many illnesses that routinely killed the population at the time.
Yeah, and this is what I say whenever we get a death like this. People will always say, but it's such a coincidence. Yes, but sometimes coincidences happen. And everything can be a coincidence in one way or another. Oh, well, that was convenient. Was it really? Or was it just something that happened? There were a lot of ways to die in the ancient world. A lot of different diseases and maladies and illnesses that they didn't know how to treat. And so it's just as likely, if not frankly more likely, that Germanicus died of disease or some other means than he did from poison. The thing is, we really don't know. Like I said, Roman historians love to talk about poison, especially, I think, in this sort of early imperial period. There's a lot of talk about poison every time somebody dies, but, it can't have been poison every time. Sometimes it really was just them getting sick, them picking up some sort of disease, and them passing away. It was a pretty common thing to happen. So basically, I usually lean towards it wasn't poison, it was a disease, but I also recognize that we can't truly know in the vast majority of these cases.
Alas, the true cause shall never be known. News of Germanicus' death quickly made its way back to Rome. Apparently, the people immediately went into mourning.
Yeah.
Somber days followed, filled with funeral processions, eulogies, and the awarding of all manner of posthumous honors. This was a tragic loss for the Empire.
Yeah, people were very upset, mass mourning, and Piso was, by the way, put on trial. He ended up dying before the trial ended. Once again, a convenient death. So what happened? Did he kill himself? Was he murdered by Tiberius? He was going to reveal something? We don't know. We don't know. Though, during that trial, it does seem like Tiberius made allowances for Piso and basically helped him out. Which, of course, only raised further suspicion, though. That could have just been Tiberius putting a word in for his guy. You know, all speculation. That's the thing with this. You know, I don't do ancient. I mean, we do a lot of ancient history on this channel. In terms of what I do academically, it isn't ancient history. I do a lot more modern stuff. And I always feel bad for ancient historians because there are so many gaps where you just have to say, I don't know. I really don't know. And I think it's fun to solve some of those puzzles. Like, okay, let me gather the sources and try to find things out. But this is sort of a case where we really, couldn't tell you what actually happened. With a lot of these things, you just have to sort of give what we know, raise your hands up and go, it could have been this, this, or this. You can judge how likely any one of those things might have been, but we don't know which it is truly.
He left behind a legacy of glory, which has echoed throughout the chapters of history to this very video. But perhaps one of the greatest legacies left behind by Germanicus would be that of his son, a young boy named Gaius who had grown up in the army camps of Germania. Nicknamed affectionately by the troops as Caligula, he would one day succeed Tiberius as the third emperor of Rome.
Yes.
But the future of his tale and that of Germania shall have to wait for another video. We hope you've appreciated this deep dive into the Avenging Varus saga. It's an incredible tale of heroics and grit from one of the great bloody conflicts of antiquity that rarely gets covered. I hope it's proved both educational and entertaining. Definitely let us know what other sagas of the past you would like to see us cover next.
It has proved very educational and entertaining, and I'm glad they did this series. And I think they're exactly right. I don't see this covered that much. And when it is covered, it's only the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. You see a fair amount of talk about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest because it was such a major defeat for Rome. Once again, major in terms of psychological impact, but how much coverage do you see of the campaigns that followed from Rome? I haven't seen that much, so I'm really glad they took the time to make this series. I thought it was really fantastic. I definitely learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know before. Which is always fun. And I think Invicta did a fantastic job with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I certainly did. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a very good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.